So today's the turning point, probably the most significant, hands down, the most significant series of events that occurred between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New in the history of Israel. Last week we saw the persecution that the Jews went through under Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV, how he outlawed Judaism, how he took the money out of the temple, attacked the city, took control of the citadel, the city of David in the city of Jerusalem, and hunted down those who had copies of the books of the law, killed them, and burned those copies, hunted down those who circumcised their children and killed both the children and the parents, tortured people brutally in order to get them to participate in the pagan sacrifices and eat swine's flesh. And it's that backdrop, it's those events that lead directly into what we're talking about today. Our handout is from the book of 1st Maccabees, with just portions. Some verses are skipped here and there, but of chapters 2 through 4. Let's start. In those days, in the days that this persecution was going on, Mattathias, son of John, son of Simeon, a priest of the clan of Joarib, moved from Jerusalem and settled in Modin. He had 5 sons: John, surnamed Gadi, Simon, called Phasi, Judas, called Maccabeus, Eleazar, called Avaran, and Jonathan, called Apphus. And those are names that they were given later. Just about all of these people had a role to play, a special role in the story that's going to unfold. The most famous and the most important today is Judas, called Maccabeus. Maccabeus means hammer. So Judas the Hammer was his name. And this family, and we're not going to call them this regularly for a little bit, but they were called the Hasmonean family. So that's going to be an important name to remember. The Hasmoneans were the most important family in Israel from this time up until the days of Herod. The Hasmoneans. So this is what happened, the inciting incident, starting there in verse 14. The king's officers, who were enforcing the apostasy, came to the town of Modin to make them offer sacrifice. They didn't just do this in Jerusalem, they went throughout the towns of Judea, and everywhere they went, they would set up an altar, they would hold a sacrifice, they would demand that the Jews participate. Many from Israel came to them, and Mattathias and his sons were assembled. Then the king's officers spoke to Mattathias as follows: You are a leader, honored and great in this town, and supported by sons and brothers. Now be the first to come and do what the king commands, as all the nations and the people of Judah and those who are left in Jerusalem have done. So an exaggeration there. Everyone else has done this. You do it to be an example to your people. Then you and your sons will be numbered among the friends of the king, and you and your sons will be honored with silver and gold and many gifts. But Mattathias answered and said in a loud voice, even if all the nations that live under the rule of the king obey him and have chosen to obey his commandments, every one of them abandoning the religion of their ancestors, I and my sons and my brothers will continue to live by the covenant of our ancestors. Far be it from us to desert the law and the ordinances. We will not obey the king's word by turning aside from our religion to the right hand or to the left. When he had finished speaking these words, a Jew came forward in the sight of all to offer sacrifice on the altar of Modin, according to the king's command. When Mattathias saw it, he burned with zeal, and his heart was stirred. He gave vent to righteous anger and ran and slaughtered him on the altar. At the same time, he killed the king's officer who was forcing them to sacrifice, and he tore down the altar. He didn't do this literally by himself, which is what it sounds like. His sons helped him in this. They had swords with them. They attacked the officer who was forcing them to sacrifice. They killed the man who had offered a sacrifice. Thus he burned with zeal for the law, just as Phinehas did against Zimri, son of Salu. And that's from Numbers 25, 1 through 15. Remember, during the plague that came upon the nation of Israel, because they turned after the gods of Moab and the women of Moab. He followed the Israelite man into a tent who came in the sight of Moses and the rest of the congregation with this Moabite woman with him, went into a tent. Phinehas was so outraged that he followed them in and drove a spear through both of their bodies. And the writer of First Maccabees is comparing that to what Mattathias did here. His zeal for the Lord, for the religion of their ancestors, is what drove him to this act. Then Mattathias cried out in the town with a loud voice, saying, let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come out with me. Then he and his sons fled to the hills and left all that they had in the town. So they left all their possessions, their homes behind them, and became outlaws, basically living out in the countryside. Then there united with them a company of Hasidians, mighty warriors of Israel, all who offered themselves willingly for the law. And all who became fugitives to escape their troubles joined them and reinforced them. They organized an army and struck down sinners in their anger and renegades in their wrath. The survivors fled to the nations for safety. And Mattathias and his friends went around and tore down the altars. They forcibly circumcised all the uncircumcised boys who they found within the borders of Israel. They hunted down the arrogant, and the work prospered in their hands. So they initiated something of a counter-persecution against those who had adopted Hellenistic culture and rejected Judaism. And at this time, there were many faithful Israelites. Also, we mentioned this last week, who were meeting in caves to keep the Sabbath, right around the beginning of when this was going down. And the Seleucid soldiers discovered and slaughtered them. Many were burned at the entrance to the caves, and those who were inside died of smoke inhalation. And about 1,000 men plus their families died in that way. And it happened because they refused to fight on the Sabbath day. Because they were attacked on the Sabbath, they refused to do anything to defend themselves that would break the law. And those who survived that massacre were some that joined Mattathias and his sons. And Mattathias told his followers to defend themselves if attacked on the Sabbath. They looked at that incident and said, we can't do this or we will be destroyed. Very clearly, we need to make an exception here. If we are attacked, we will defend ourselves. And Mattathias led his band of rebels for only about a year before he died. Mattathias died in the 146th year and was probably, I didn't look that up, but I believe that's calculating time from the beginning of the, it's either from Alexander the Great's empire or the Seleucid Empire, I'm not sure. But all Israel mourned for him with great lamentation. So basically the conservative camp, the conservative people, the brave ones, a very, very good number of people have gone out and joined Mattathias, and more do all the time. The greater victories they experience, the more people start believing in their movement. But after Mattathias died, his son Judas, who was called Maccabeus, again, the hammer, took command in his place. All his brothers and all who had joined his father helped him. They gladly fought for Israel. When King Antiochus heard these reports, he was greatly angered, and he sent and gathered all the forces of his kingdom, a very strong army. And I skipped ahead a little bit there. I want to insert some things. This didn't happen right away. Antiochus didn't hear about Judas right away and this rebellion immediately. So at the beginning, Judas and his followers met very little organized resistance. Okay, they kept doing what Mattathias had done, going around raiding towns, not for the sake of taking plunder, but for the sake of circumcising kids, making sure that the law was being kept. And his main goal was to purify the Jewish people, to undo what Antiochus had done. But the first people to really notice Judas were the Samaritans. And the Samaritans, their general, came against him with a small army. They really underestimated Judas. And Judas and his followers defeated them. And he killed the Samaritan commander and took his sword and kept it with him for the rest of his life. And then after that, the general in charge of the area north of Israel, around Damascus, realized that Judas was actually gathering a real army, becoming a military threat. And so he, in the interest of defending the Seleucid kingdom, marched south and was joined by many Hellenistic Jews. This was two wars at the same time. It was a war for independence, and it was a civil war simultaneously that Judas had to fight. The Hellenists, the Jews that wanted to keep the Greek customs, they joined this army and later armies to fight against Judas and his followers. And when the Syrian general approached the ascent of Beth Horon, this is a part that isn't in your sheet, Judas went out to meet him with a small company. But when they saw the army coming to meet them, they said to Judas, "How can we, few as we are, fight against so great and strong a multitude? And we are faint, for we haven't eaten anything today." Judas replied, "It is easy for many to be hemmed in by few. For in the sight of heaven there is no difference between saving by many or by few." Taking encouragement from their history, right? From what Jonathan said long ago. Nothing can prevent the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. Judas said, "It is not the size of the army that victory in battle depends, not on the size that victory in battle depends, but strength comes from heaven. They come against us in great pride and lawlessness to destroy us and our wives and our children and to despoil us. But we fight for our lives and our laws. He himself will crush them before us. As for you, do not be afraid of them. And that was a big aspect of this. And Judas isn't the only person in history who's had this kind of experience as a small, unimportant, local fighter against an invading force. The people who are fighting for their very lives, for their homeland, are going to fight harder than the people who come against them, especially the Seleucids seriously relied on mercenaries. They were not natives to that area at all. They had only a political interest in keeping it under their control. But when Judas had finished speaking, he rushed suddenly against Saron and his army. It's the general. And they were crushed before him. They pursued him down the descent of Beth Horon to the plain. 800 of them fell, and the rest fled into the land of the Philistines. Then Judas and his brothers began to be feared, and terror fell upon the Gentiles round about them. His fame reached the king, and the Gentiles talked of the battles of Judas. And that's where the handout picks up. When King Antiochus heard these reports, he was greatly angered. And he sent and gathered all the forces of his kingdom, a very strong army. And it wasn't nearly as strong as he would have liked. I mean, to the Jews, when this army came against them, it seemed massive, but it wasn't nearly as massive as it should have been. It actually happened at a very bad time for Antiochus. There were rebellions breaking out in other areas of his kingdom as well. And remember, he had made this a nationwide thing. It wasn't just Israel that was experiencing this kind of thing. It was worse for Israel than anywhere else because they cared so much about the traditions of their ancestors that God had given them that were contradictory to what the Greeks practiced, but there was unrest everywhere. He was having a hard time controlling things. And the higher taxes that they had been taking from people didn't help either. There was unrest, there were rebellions. As a result of those rebellions, taxes weren't getting paid, which means that Antiochus couldn't afford to hire the mercenaries he wanted to hire to put down these rebellions, which means the taxes weren't coming in. And it was a cycle. It was a vicious cycle that was draining him economically and splitting his kingdom apart. So Antiochus had been a very overgenerous king, a very spontaneous, free spending king, acting as if he had more money than he had. And it was starting to catch up with him here. In addition, of course, to the debt they still owed to Rome. Antiochus took part of his army on a campaign into Persia to collect the taxes that they were owed by the Persians. So he actually didn't march into Judea. Antiochus left a man named Lysias in charge of his kingdom with the responsibility of putting down the rebellion in Judea. So the Seleucid army the Jewish rebels faced, although it seemed incredibly large to them, wasn't nearly as large as it would have been if the power of the Seleucids hadn't already been declining. And there are mentions throughout here of elephants in the army as well, which is an interesting observation. They were not supposed to have elephants because of the treaty that they signed with Rome. That's one of the things they weren't allowed to have, but they did. They did. Elephants were, Indian elephants specifically, were something the Greeks discovered on their campaign into India and really loved the idea of. It really gave the Seleucids an edge in combat. Elephants were the ancient equivalent of a tank. Really, you just as a common foot soldier, you see an elephant coming toward you and you think, how on earth do I kill that thing? So let's go back to the handout. Antiochus appointed Lysias, a distinguished man of royal lineage, in charge of the king's affairs from the river Euphrates to the borders of Egypt. And he turned over to Lysias half of his forces and the elephants, and gave him orders about all that he wanted done. As for the residents of Judea and Jerusalem, Lysia was to send a force against them to wipe out and destroy the strength of Israel and the remnant of Jerusalem. And he was to banish the memory of them from the place, settle strangers in all their territory, and distribute their land by lot. So that was basically Lysias' job, to do what the Assyrians had done to the northern kingdom, what the Babylonians had done to Judah long ago, to just destroy the country and disperse it and sell to slavery, partially as an effort to, work toward fixing their financial problem. So they set out with their entire force. And when they arrived, they encamped near Emmaus in the plain. And this is not Lysias himself leading this army, but it is sent by Lysias. When the traders of that region heard what was said to them, they took silver and gold in immense amounts and fetters and went to the camp to get the Israelites for slaves. And forces from Syria and the land of the Philistines joined with them. So they had buyers lined up already for the slaves that they were going to capture in this battle. They were there with the army, with their gold ready, with their chains ready, expecting a load of prisoners. After this, Judas appointed leaders of the people. Okay, yep, I didn't skip anything. He appointed leaders of the people in charge of thousands and hundreds and fifties and tens. And he said to those who were building houses, or were betrothed, or were planting vineyards, or were faint-hearted, that each should return to his home according to the law. Then the army marched out and encamped to the south of Emmaus. Something that the Jews discovered based on the advice, based on the instructions God had given them, is that they fought much, much better with a smaller, more courageous force than with a large army full of people motivated to flee if the battle turned ugly. So Judas said, "Gird yourselves and be valiant. Be ready early in the morning to fight with these Gentiles who have assembled against us to destroy us and our sanctuary. It is better for us to die than to see the misfortunes of our nation and of the sanctuary. But as his will in heaven may be, so he will do." There are far fewer direct references to God in First Maccabees compared to Second Maccabees. First Maccabees is a more political, historical book. Second Maccabees is a more religious book. But God is still mentioned, specifically in much of what Judas himself said. Now, Gorgias, I'll call him Gorgias, was one of the commanders of this army. And he took 5,000 infantry and 1,000 picked cavalry, so a very good chunk of men away from the army. This division moved out by night to fall upon the camp of the Jews and attack them suddenly. Men from the citadel were his guides. But Judas heard of it, and he and his mighty men moved out to attack the king's force in Emmaus while the division was still absent from the camp. So they moved past each other. Judas and his men went to attack the main camp. Well, this other division, these men were gone from it while they were weakened. And when Gorgias entered the camp of Judas by night, he found no one there. And he looked for them in the hills because he said, "These men are fleeing from us." So he began a wild goose chase all night, going through the hills looking for Judas and his men, while Judas was attacking their camp behind them. At daybreak, Judas appeared in the plain with 3,000 men, but they did not have armor and swords such as they desired. And they saw the camp of the nations, strong and fortified, with cavalry all around it. And these men were trained in war. And that cavalry probably included elephants as well. But Judas said to those who were with him, "Do not fear their numbers or be afraid when they charge. Let us cry to heaven and see whether he will favor us and remember his covenant with our ancestors and crush this army before us today. Then all the nations will know that there is one who redeems and saves Israel." When the foreigners looked up and saw them coming against them, they went out from their camp to battle. Then the men with Judas blew their trumpets and engaged in battle. The nations were crushed and fled into the plain, and those in the rear fell by the sword. They pursued them to Gazara and to the plains of Idumea and to Azotus and Jamnia, and 3,000 of them fell. And that was another aspect of Judas's strategy, something he did many times. He attacked the enemy very quickly and when they weren't expecting it. He and his men began a tradition, a very strong tradition that was carried on by others after him, of guerrilla warfare. And yeah, as we mentioned last week, freedom fighters, small groups of zealous Jews who fought against much larger forces, much larger empires, which got them into trouble later when they fought for worse reasons. But for Judas, it worked very well, fighting to defend the law and the people of God. And there were some more political things that happened in between here, but then Judas and his brothers said in verse 36, "See, our enemies are crushed. Let us go up to cleanse the sanctuary and dedicate it." So all the army assembled and went up to Mount Zion. Oh, now there was another actual battle after this. After this force that Lysias had sent was defeated, Lysias himself came. Okay, so they have the Samaritans, they had the Syrians, they had this army from the Seleucids, and then they had the main force. Each of these armies kept getting bigger and bigger, and they won against each one of them. When Lysias himself came into Judea, the rebels won yet another victory with only 10,000 men, which is still a lot of men. They had 10,000 men against 65,000 men. And Lysias returned to Antioch after that, planning to lead another army against the followers of Judas once they could afford more mercenaries, which they really couldn't at that time. But Judas and his brothers said, "See, our enemies are crushed. Let us go up and cleanse the sanctuary and dedicate it." So all the army assembled and went up to Mount Zion. There they saw the sanctuary desolate, the altar profaned, and the gates burned. In the courts, they saw bushes sprung up as in a thicket, or as on one of the mountains. They saw also the chambers of the priests in ruins. Then they tore their clothes and mourned with great lamentation. They sprinkled themselves with ashes and fell face down on the ground, and they blew the signal trumpets, and they cried out to heaven. Then Judas detailed the men to fight against those in the citadel, until he had cleansed the sanctuary. Jerusalem was still under Seleucid control. That group of soldiers that had taken the city of David were still in there. So as his men fought the people in the citadel, others started work cleansing the temple. He chose blameless priests devoted to the law, and they cleansed the sanctuary and removed the defiled stones of the altar to an unclean place. Oh, sorry. Yeah, defiled stones just in general to an unclean place. He deals with the altar here. They deliberated what to do about the altar of burnt offering, which had been profaned. And they thought it best to tear it down so that it would not be a lasting shame to them that the nations had defiled it. So they tore down the altar and stored the stones in a convenient place on the temple hill until a prophet should come to tell what to do with them. Then they took unhewn stones, as the law directs, and built a new altar like the former one. So just another reminder, when this happened, the line of prophets had ended. They didn't have a prophet to tell them, this is God's will, this is what you should do about this or that. They relied on the law, what God had already told them. Then Judas and his brothers and all the assembly of Israel determined that every year at that season, the days of dedication of the altar should be observed with joy and gladness for 8 days, beginning with the 25th day of the month of Chislev. And that is what we call today the Feast of Hanukkah. That is where Hanukkah comes from. It commemorates the cleansing of the temple, the rededication of the altar by Judas Maccabeus. So, if someone would like to look up just really quickly, John chapter 10, verses 22 and 23. So this was one of the feasts, the feast of dedication that Jesus himself kept, that he traveled to Jerusalem for. And it was added to the festivals that they had already established. I mean, there were festivals established by God, feasts that he put in place to commemorate certain things in their history or to for certain religious reasons. And then there were 2 main ones that were established after that. Purim, which we read about in Esther, and then the Feast of Dedication, or Hanukkah, which was established here. And so the sanctuary was cleansed. The temple was cleansed and reclaimed by the conservative Jews at this time. Any questions about anything this morning? All right, let's go ahead and close. Father, thank you that you are the same yesterday and today and forever. That just as people so long ago could look back at their history and find encouragement and find reasons to have confidence in you, we can do the same. Help us to remember that these things are not as remote as they feel, that they're not part of a different universe, a different world, but that these are things you have done in history to show your glory, your power, so that we may have confidence in you. Help us to have confidence in you as we try to live for you. Help us to remember your promises to us, and in everything to bring honor to you, to be a witness to those around us of your greatness, to change lives and to work through people. In Jesus' name, amen.